Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. This is a webinar that will focus on a variety of different stakeholders and what they're doing to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, specifically with a focus on those that won our Climate Leadership Awards last year. As we get started, my name is Verena Radulovic. I'll be your co-host today. I am the Director for Corporate Engagement for C2ES. C2ES is an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and we work to forge practical solutions to climate change. With me today, I am joined by my colleague, Alex Carr, who actually works at the Climate Registry, and I'll let her introduce herself in just a moment. We have a lineup from San Diego County Regional Airport Authority, the LA Sanitation and Environment Climate Action Program, Wyoming Infrastructure Authority, and Xcel Energy. So we're really excited to hear from our panelists today as they walk through what they're specifically doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Before that, a few housekeeping items. We are going to be recording this webinar, so everybody is muted. We are going to ask folks to submit their questions in the chat function, and once the panelists present, we're going to have a moderated discussion, and then we'll be able to ask questions that I'll be synthesizing. So please go ahead and send them in, and we'll be looking for them throughout the webinar. So with that, the webinar today is you're gonna hear a variety of different ways that public and private sector organizations are approaching reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're at a time when there's a lot of focus and attention on how various different entities are reducing their emissions, particularly hard to tackle greenhouse gas emissions. And we're seeing a lot of action and activity from different sectors and how they're thinking about making those reductions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex Carr, who's going to talk a little bit about the Climate Leadership Awards, which are the basis for what we're doing today with this webinar.
So for those of you who don't know TCR, we're an NGO that was set up back in 2007 by states and provinces, and they continue to govern us to this day. And what we do is help companies and governments build capacity in greenhouse gas measurement, reporting, and verification. Which, as we know, is a critical foundation for making good decisions about managing and reducing emissions. So we also develop protocols, standards, programs, and services that help organizations reduce carbon. And we build partnerships in North America and around the world to showcase subnational leadership and impact. So that includes our annual subnational delegation to COP in partnership with the Climate Action Reserve. And bringing us back to why we're all here today, our partnership with C2ES on the Climate Leadership Conference and Awards. So just to give you a bit of quick history on the awards, we launched the program back in 2012 in partnership with US EPA, really to continue the legacy of their Climate Leaders program. US EPA left the partnership in 2017, but C2ES and TCR have continued the program since then, and we continue to be committed to it in light of the fact that it's really more important than ever to recognize and incentivize climate action. And I'm delighted to say that over the years, we've recognized more than 185 companies, organizations, and individuals from diverse sectors across the US. And as Verena mentioned, the folks you're hearing from today are just a sampling of winners from the 2020 cohort. So just before we turn it over to them, I wanted to flag that our 10th anniversary event is scheduled for May 2021 in New Orleans, which we really hope is going to be in person. And after a decade of running the awards program, we're taking a step back to interrogate what it means to be a climate leader in 2020 and beyond. We know we need to get to net zero. We know this is a critical decade for climate, and we know we need more ambition at all levels and in all sectors. So that's really going to be top of mind this year. And we're going to be looking to craft our awards criteria to support and reflect more ambition. And just as importantly, we're going to be doing the work to ensure that the program is inclusive and equitable. So again, looking at the criteria as well as potentially introducing new award categories this year. And we're looking forward to sharing more information on that towards the late summer and early fall. So stay tuned. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Verena to introduce today's presenters.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. And apologies earlier. My computer decided to mute itself unexpectedly. So first up, we're going to hear from Chad Reese. Chad is the Environmental Affairs Manager at the San Diego County Regional Airport Authority, and that's the agency that manages the day-to-day operations of the San Diego International Airport. He has a background in clean technology project management, and he currently manages projects and the policies related to the airport's sustainability management program, including air quality and emissions, transportation electrification, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and waste reduction. He's also on the board of directors of the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative, as well as the San Diego Regional Clean Cities Coalition and the advisory board of the San Diego Regional Smart Cities Collaborative. So with that, thanks very much, Chad, and he's going to talk to us about all of the really interesting things that San Diego is doing.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I don't see my slide deck yet. There it is. Okay. As mentioned, I'm Chad Reese, Manager of Environmental Affairs at the San Diego County Regional Airport Authority, the managing organization of San Diego International Airport. Next slide. So for some context, San Diego International is a 51-gate large hub airport that served over 25 million passengers in 2019. It's the busiest single runway airport in the U.S., confined to a humble 661 acres, and we're expecting 50% passenger growth by 2035. So in other words, we have a lot to do with the little, and that constraint requires creativity. Next slide. And that creativity is sustainability. So what you're seeing is a definition of sustainability that's very specific to our airport. And this definition was created by our board of directors and executive team a few years ago. I'm going to call out two pieces. The first is enduring and resilient, and that acknowledges the focus on protecting against natural or man-made shocks to the system, not unlike the one we're seeing today. And also by focusing on the triple bottom line, which is financial, social, and environmental aspects of an organization. Next slide, please. Each year, we publish a sustainability report on the airport in which we track and communicate over 30 key performance indicators across 20 material issues. We publish this within the guidance of the Global Reporting Initiative framework. And if you're interested, you can view our sustainability reporting at sustain.san.org. Next slide, please. So the airport sustainability management program comprises 7 distinct plans. The 4 that you see on top have a nexus with this presentation: strategic energy, carbon neutrality, clean transportation, and climate resilience. The 3 highlighted below, the less important, are the biodiversity, zero waste, and water stewardship plans that round out our sustainability management program. I'm going to spend a few quick moments describing the carbon neutrality aspects of these plans at SAN. Next slide. So each year, the airport conducts annual greenhouse gas emission inventories using a system specific to airports called Airport Carbon Accreditation. In this framework, SAN has achieved the highest level of certification. So that means not only are we managing and reducing our emissions under our direct control, or Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but we're also engaging our third party, or Scope 3 tenants. And we offset our residual airport controlled emissions using a program that we've developed and launched at San Diego. And I'll revisit this idea in just a moment. Next slide. We're currently finalizing our calendar year 2019 emissions inventory now. The graphic that you see here represents the emissions under the authority's direct control, and that only accounts for about 2% of total emissions at the airport. So year over year, as we reduce airport control emissions, that piece of the pie continues to decrease. So the other roughly 98% of emissions at the airport are divided into about 64% aircraft-related emissions and 34% ground transportation-related emissions. Next slide. For airport-controlled emissions, we offset those residual emissions using a carbon offset program launched by San Diego International a few years ago. It's called the Good Traveler. Now the Good Traveler comprises 18 partner airports across the country that have offset over 670 million miles of travel. The carbon offset program is also available for travelers to offset the impacts of their travel. The program is poised to offset travel emissions when passengers return to the airport. We're seeing historic low enplanements now. For more information about the Good Traveler, an interested party can visit thegoodtraveler.org. Next slide. for emissions that the authority doesn't directly control but can only guide or influence, we're working on initiatives around supporting sustainable aviation fuel usage by improving airfield efficiency for taxiing aircraft, by expanding EV charging for passengers, staff, and airside ground support equipment, by facilitating alternative modes of travel to the airport, and by reducing potable water use whenever possible. So the metric is a greenhouse gas intensity measured by scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and our target is a 30% reduction below 2015 levels by 2035. Next slide, please. The authority also works closely with a number of regional partners, including some that were mentioned in my intro, Clean Tech San Diego on the Smart Cities initiatives. We work with the DOE-funded San Diego Regional Clean Cities Coalition. We work with the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative, among others. And what you see here is a graphic, a snapshot of the Climate Collaborative's annual report. The group includes 26 member organizations representing over 80% of public agencies in San Diego. And collectively, we're working on programs around energy efficiency, climate adaptation, climate smart water, coastal resilience, and others. And next slide. That concludes my high-level presentation today. A note that you can read and download all of the plans in our sustainability management program at san.org/green. I look forward to Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chad. All right, next up, we have Jeremy Pathmanabhan. And Jeremy comes to us. He is the program manager for the Los Angeles Sanitation and Environment's Climate Action Program. And there he oversees a variety of projects that are geared toward understanding the city's greenhouse gas emissions and trying to position the city to make data-driven decisions towards the climate adaptation and mitigation goals. Prior to that, Jeremy worked for the South Coast Air Quality Management District in their Science and Technology Advancement section. And here, one of the things that we'll hear from Jeremy in a moment is, how the city of Los Angeles is addressing its greenhouse gas emissions. But, part of the reason why they won the Climate Leadership Award was for setting an aggressive goal, moving towards 100% renewable energy, building electrification, and really targeting their transportation emissions. So with that, Jeremy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Good morning. All right, we got the first slide. So just some quick background before I get into what the City of Los Angeles is doing. A little bit of background on the City of Los Angeles. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with where we are and sort of those type of things. But the City of Los Angeles as an organization has a pretty broad array of operations. So in addition to your typical municipal services, such as police, fire, libraries, we operate 2 airports, including Los Angeles International Airport. We operate the Port of Los Angeles, which is the largest seaport in the United States. We have the Department of Water and Power, which is the largest water and power utility in the United States. We provide potable water as well as electricity to all 4 million of our residents. We also have 4 wastewater treatment plants, water reclamation plants that treat wastewater and sewage from within our city. We provide solid resources and trash services for all residential customers within the city. And we also operate our own public transit fleet. So as far as municipalities go, the City of Los Angeles is relatively uniquely positioned to have a little bit more control over greenhouse gas emissions, sort of a path forward than maybe your average municipality. Next slide. And so under the leadership of Mayor Eric Garcetti, back in 2015, the city put out its Sustainable City Plan. And that plan addressed the environment, economy, and equity all in one holistic package. It looked at all 3 of these attributes sort of on equal footing. And in 2015, our goal was set at your standard 80 by 50. Right, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 levels by 80% by 2050. Fast forward 4 years, and in 2019, Mayor Eric Garcetti released LA's Green New Deal. And what the Green New Deal did was, it was really sort of an update to that original sustainable city plan, and it pushed the ambition up another level. And it committed the city to reducing its community-wide greenhouse gas emissions to carbon neutrality to zero by 2050. And the city of Los Angeles as an organization would reduce its operational emissions to carbon neutrality by 2045. So it accelerated our targets, and it put us on track and in alignment with all of the commitments in the Paris Climate Agreement. Next slide. And the way we're planning on getting to carbon neutrality is really built on 4 pillars, right? A zero carbon grid, zero carbon buildings, zero carbon on-road transportation, and then zero waste. And the city is addressing this through a variety of programs in all 4 of these sectors. So in the zero carbon grid, again, our Department of Water and Power, as was previously mentioned, we've committed to being 100% renewable by 2045. As of 2018, we're at 30% renewable. We're going to hit, I think as of 2019, the initial data sets show we're at 35% renewable. So we're making great progress towards those goals. And at the same time, we're working on energy efficiency programs and education projects. And we've been able to level off and decrease the total consumption of electricity by the city over the past 10 years or so. So what that means is we don't have to focus on finding new generation sources. Instead, we're focusing on converting to renewables, and we're able to maintain and decrease the total demand and strain put on our grid. A huge consumer of electricity in Los Angeles are our buildings. And there is a lot of focus on new building stock and making them fully electric or net zero. But in 2017, the city of Los Angeles also passed the existing building energy and water efficiency ordinance. And what that ordinance did is it required all buildings above 25,000 square feet, if they're a private building, and all government city buildings above 10,000 square feet, to report their energy and water usage on an annual basis to the city. And then the worst performing buildings are required to conduct energy audits and retrofits to bring the performance back up. And so what this does is twofold. One is it provides us a lot of data with building performance, which buildings are performing better, which aren't doing as well. And it focuses our resources on the worst performing buildings. So rather than trying to go across the board and force and spend resources on a wide array of buildings, we're collecting the data, analyzing it, and we're focusing on the lowest performing buildings and spending our resources. We're going to see the greatest gain by bringing them up to a higher specification. The third thing that we're working on is on-road transportation. So on-road transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions on a community scale within the city of Los Angeles, as well as in the state of California. And we have a constant pressure pushing up in that population is growing, people are driving more. And so vehicle miles traveled are increasing. Just quick side note, everything I say about trends is as of end of 2019. COVID has sort of thrown a lot of the trends in different directions. But so we have this constant pressure pushing vehicle miles and total miles traveled up. But what we've actually seen is fuel efficiency gains have overset that, and we're still seeing a decrease in on-road transportation, as well as people in general actually driving. Your per capita miles traveled is actually decreasing. So people are driving less, the population is just growing, and that's still pushing our emissions up a little bit. But in the transportation sector, the city is committed to converting all of its transit fleet to 100% electric by 2030, which means as of 2018, we no longer purchase fossil fuel buses. We're only purchasing EV buses. So LA County Metro has also made a similar commitment. And so by 2030, actually in Los Angeles, the vast majority of the public transportation system will be all electric. We're also conducting pilot studies. Our Department of Transportation has the Blue LA program, which is the EV car sharing program focused on disadvantaged communities. And then even on the off-road transportation, our Los Angeles World Airports, our aviation or airport department is working with airline partners to use biofuels for their flights. And there's providing electricity for planes so that they don't have to run their auxiliary power units. And similarly, at the Port of Los Angeles, we've incentivized vessel speed reduction to reduce fuel usage in the harbor area, as well as provide shoreside power so that the cargo ships don't have to be running their auxiliary power units either. They can use shoreside electricity. And the final sort of pillar area that we're working in is zero waste. So landfills are a huge source of methane emissions. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, especially when you look at the short term of 20 to 25 years. And when you look at landfills, 90% of the emissions coming out of our landfills are coming from recyclables and organic waste. And so the huge push is to further adoption in recycling and to start diverting organic waste out of our landfills to more productive uses. And to do that, the city is undergoing a series of pilot studies. We're working with technology companies to see if we can develop digesters that can digest yard waste and food waste mixed together. We're taking a look to understand whether we can have people put their food waste through their garbage disposal and maybe have that garbage, have the sewers carry the food waste over to wastewater treatment plants where they're co-digested with sewage sludge to produce renewable natural gas, or even whether we just take food waste and put it straight into our wastewater treatment plants to produce biogas. So this is just a handful of projects and policies that the city is doing. Being the second largest city in the United States, I think we view it as a commitment and a responsibility to be a leader in this field. It's something that the mayor and the city as a whole is really committed to. And the projects I talked about now and these 4 areas, these aren't necessarily going to get us all the way to where we need to go. I think the carbon neutrality targets we set and the ambitions we set, that's where we know we need to go. That's sort of our North Star. That's what we're aiming for. This alone is not going to get us there, but I think this is our initial cut at it, and our commitment is to continue to iterate, use the best science, technology, and data available, and continue to make progress till we do reach that goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Great. All right, and next up, we're going to hear from Jason Beggar. Jason is the current Executive Director of the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority, and that's a state instrumentality created by the Wyoming legislature to facilitate and support the development of energy infrastructure. It created the Integrated Test Center, which will host the carbon capture and utilization storage testing. And he's worked with the Petroleum Association of Wyoming and Rio Tinto Energy America, which later became Cloud Peak Energy. He is from a family ranch in eastern Montana and has worked for 2 members of Montana's congressional delegation. I call that out because I used to live in Montana, so I love that. And the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority won the Innovative Partnership Certificate within the Climate Leadership Awards, specifically for bringing together government entities, electrical cooperatives, energy producers, educational institutions, and others to try to figure out how to turn carbon dioxide into a marketable resource. And they also provided $21 million in funding for the creation of a research test facility. So Jason will talk about those specific carbon capture efforts. And with that, Jason, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about what we're working on here in Wyoming. As was mentioned, work for the Infrastructure Authority, and kind of a quick note, as of July 1st, it'll be rebranded the Wyoming Energy Authority, kind of bringing together a few entities within the state that are really focused on this sort of project deployment, sound policy, public assistance, those types of things. So we are in the swan song for the Infrastructure Authority, but really excited to kind of take this to this next level. So kind of the next slide, please. All right, so one question we get asked a lot is, Wyoming, or a statement I guess made a lot is it's kind of strange that Wyoming is in this carbon situation. Here we are by far and away the largest exporter of fossil energy BTUs, largest coal producer, top 10 in oil and natural gas. We have a lot of uranium. We have a lot of renewables as well. But it just seems strange that Wyoming would be taking such a leadership role in this. But the fact of the matter is, the fossil energy industry is such a large component of our economy. It's roughly 2/3. This year certainly has been challenging, and we'll see what the final numbers come in, but still a significant driver, paying for schools, paying for, a Hathaway scholarship, which is basically any high school student in Wyoming that meets certain criteria can go to college for free. New schools across the state, those types of things. So not to mention just the jobs that it creates. So, our goal in all of this, unabashedly, is how do we keep fossil energy industry viable in an important part of the economy while addressing these societal concerns over carbon emissions. We don't have our head in the sand. We certainly recognize and realize that the industry's changing, consumer demands are changing, those types of things, but you can't just flip a switch overnight. And so what can we do to protect the health of our state's economy, keep people employed, and sort of navigate this transition? Another thing is, can we turn a liability into an asset? Best case scenario is CO2 is, it's a waste project, right? Or waste product. Worst case scenario, there's a liability. And so can we turn that liability into an asset using things for, such as enhanced oil recovery, CO2 to products? If you think about it, limestone, which goes into a lot of building materials such as concrete, is basically mineralized carbon dioxide. So is there a way to capture that, convert it into some other things, carbon fibers, fuels, those types of stuff? Very interesting chemistry that's out there. We also know that economic drivers certainly push change much quicker and much faster than sort of a policy push. That economic pull is certainly a much stronger incentive. And then sort of lastly, being at the table, let's position the state as a leader on these solutions. Senator Enzi from Wyoming has a great saying that says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so let's be front and center at some of these discussions and figure out how to help drive policies and these changes in a way that best fits our state. So next slide, please. So the question is, how do we do that? We have a very low population. Our congressional delegation consists of 3. So really looking at what could we do, how could we do it? And what we realized is that when you look back historically over the last 100 years or so, technology has always been the linchpin in solving sort of these great environmental challenges. Let's stop looking at carbon management, climate change, global warming, all of those things as this political football. Instead, looking at it as more of a engineering challenge, because that's what it is. And when you look at things as an engineering challenge, sort of you take a deep breath, you roll your sleeves up and figure out how to move forward. And it doesn't matter what an individual state does. When you look at global carbon emissions as a whole, you're going to have to employ solutions that are going to be used by China, India, South Korea, Indonesia, all of these Asian countries whose carbon emissions profiles, if they haven't already surpassed the US, they're going to shortly. And so while we need an array of solutions, technology solutions that can be bolted on and used elsewhere is going to be key. And so what Wyoming started doing about 20 years ago is developing the basic sort of research pieces. We stood up the School of Energy Resources, which does that fundamental research. We've got our Center for Economic Geology Research, which is characterizing, deep saline storage, basically anything underground. Where could we sequester, or what sort of characteristics in geology do we need to know about in order to permanently sequester CO2? Our Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, looking again at geology, but using that CO2 to lower the carbon footprint of transportation fuels. Our corridor initiatives. This isn't just about power plants. Ethanol plants are huge emitters of CO2, as are cement plants. A lot of our industrial, facilities that drive and power, our society emit CO2. And so if we're going to have a society that manages those emissions, you're going to have to move that CO2 from those sources to places it can be used. And so we've working on something called our corridor initiative. And what that is looking at the best places to site that infrastructure in places that, minimize, like wildlife impacts, minimize the interference with additional infrastructure that's there, such as, roads and electrical transmission lines, those types of things. So, if you identify those pathways, not only across Wyoming, but across the US, it's going to be easier to say, okay, we need to build a pipeline from, the Midwest in, say, Illinois, where we've got a large concentration of ethanol plants, to the Permian Basin in West Texas, which are great places to actually hold that CO2. And then lastly, talked a little bit about the Energy Authority, or introduced it anyway, where, kind of still, working through that, to have the training wheels on, but, using that as a vehicle to sort of sew all of these ideas together as to how we, promote the state, promote the things that we're doing, actually you have them deployed, because you can have the best idea in the world, but unless it's got traction and somebody's using it, it doesn't do anybody much good. So next slide, please. So that kind of brings us to our Integrated Test Center and the facility that won the award earlier this year. And as the state was looking at these technologies, we saw, okay, what are the gaps? We've got these great ideas, small scale laboratories, universities, those types of things. We recognize that there really is a valley of death in technology deployment. And part of that is these projects need to be scaled up in such a way to see if they work at a commercial level. And there are very few places, not just in the US, but in the world, to scale up those really promising technologies. Nobody is going to invest $1 billion in a carbon capture project or a technology if they're not very, very certain that it's going to work. So we partnered with our utilities in Wyoming. And so this is a partnership between the state of Wyoming Basic and Electric Power Cooperative, which owns the Dry Fork Power Station, which is a coal-fired power plant that was brought online about 10 years ago. Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association, which is a rural electric cooperative generating organization. And then the last thing was the other partner was the National Rural Electric Cooperatives to build this facility that would allow those technologies to come in and scale up. Whether it's a private sector company that has the capital and the ability to do this, they just need a place to plug and play, or these projects and technologies that are affiliated with the U.S. Department of Energy. As I mentioned, there are not a lot of these facilities out there, and a lot of U.S. technologies actually have to go to a facility in Norway to test at this sort of scale. So a little bit of economic development opportunity for the state as well. Another one of our partners in this is the NRG COSIA Carbon X Prize competition. For folks that may not be familiar with XPRIZE or Carbon XPRIZE specifically, what they're doing is they're going to award up or $20 million in total prize money to the technology developers that are best able to deliver and demonstrate a technology that captures CO2 and then converts it into some other marketable project. So there's a facility in Alberta, Canada, that is testing technologies off a natural gas plant, and then here in Wyoming, we're testing technologies off our coal plant. So hopefully by the end of this year, maybe early next year, those winners will be announced. But again, you know, what we're really focused on is providing those technologies that can be scaled up and then deployed around the world to have, you know, truly a global impact. You know, another area why technology is so important, and this really feeds off of the previous speaker. One thing that, you know, for years and years and years, it was just like, well, we need to move away from fossil and, you know, need to go towards renewables. But renewables can only take you so far when you're looking at a resilient grid. You know, battery storage may provide a solution, but it's not quite there yet at a commercial level. But we've seen states like California and Colorado move away from a renewable fuel standard to actually a low carbon standard. And so carbon capture off of a fossil plant qualifies and it actually meets a lot of criteria, saying it's a zero carbon electricity source, but it's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not just when the sun's shining or the wind's blowing or things like that. So really interested in working with some of these states that have moved more to a zero carbon standard. And that's the point that Wyoming is always saying, is if the goal is low carbon and a fossil energy product can provide it, it shouldn't matter that's a fossil energy. It should be a low carbon product. And so really, I'm really excited at working with our stakeholders and you know, these folks to move these technologies forward. So next slide. And there is my contact information. So we do have some social media channels and some things. So folks, you can just sort of Google those and find us if you want to keep up to date on things, but look forward to answering some questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jason. All right. We're going to go ahead and move to our final speaker. We're going to have Jeff Ling. And Jeff, can you hear me? Are you on the line?
I'm here.
Super duper. Okay. So Jeff is the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at Xcel Energy, and that is a U.S. utility serving 3.6 million electricity customers and 2 million natural gas customers in 8 states. He's responsible for developing strategy and policies that will continue the company's leadership in the clean energy transition while also keeping customer bills low. And in previous roles, Jeff was a senior policy advisor with the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University, renewable energy policy manager in the previous Colorado Governor Bill Ritter's administration, and he's also been the director of Western States Regulatory Affairs for O-Power. And you know, one thing I failed to mention earlier is, and I apologize, Chad and Jeremy, both the City of Los Angeles as well as the San Diego Airport received the Greenhouse Gas Management Excellence Award, as well as a certificate in goal setting. And then the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority won the Innovation Partnership Award, but Xcel won back in 2020, won the Organizational Leadership Award. And I think what we've seen is a lot of utilities have in the last 6 months to 12 months set these really ambitious carbon reduction goals, but Xcel was actually the first one to do so. So Jeff will talk about kind of the transition to a low carbon future and net zero, and Xcel was also recognized for investing in low carbon transportation efforts, as well as setting out a vision for how a utility can actually achieve its carbon reduction. So Jeff, with that, I will turn it over to you.
So thanks so much, Verena. Thank you, Alex. Thank you to C2ES and TCR for hosting the webinar, and of course for the award. I'm not able to see the slides, but that's okay. We can advance just the same, and I'll be a little bit more explicit about which slide that I'm on. So First, a bit about Xcel Energy. As Verena mentioned, we really are a utility of 4 different operating companies serving 8 states from the upper Midwest down to the Texas Panhandle. 3.7 million electric customers, 2.1 million gas customers. We've been a national recognized leader in wind energy for some time. We have close to 10,000 megawatts of wind on our system. That's been driven primarily through a strategy that we call Steel for Fuel, where we can avail our customers of low-cost wind energy, take advantage of the production tax credit, really take advantage of the significant wind resource that is available in our service territory. We've had energy efficiency programs for 2 decades now, programs that continue to evolve, that continue to advance, particularly around strategic or beneficial electrification, which I hope we'll talk about later in the discussion. And then certainly around carbon dioxide emissions reductions, and that's really what I'm going to focus my comments on. Moving to the next slide, leading the clean energy transition. On December the 4th of 2018, we made a corporate-wide announcement that by 2030, we would reduce CO2 emissions 80% from a 2005 baseline, and an aspiration to deliver carbon-free electricity by 2050. That was a bold goal at the time. It's still a bold goal. And in fact, I think the interim target, as we call it, the 80% reduction, is among the most stringent still in the industry. And it's true, as Verena had mentioned, there have been now over a dozen large utilities that have made similar commitments, either zero or net zero commitments by 2050. So a tremendous transition has happened just in the last 18 months in the utility sector. I'm really most proud of the reductions that we've achieved to date, at 44% reduction as of the end of last year. I do want to point out that all of our carbon emissions are tracked and accounted for using the Climate Registry electric sector protocol, which are, of course, third-party verified data we submit to TCR. And we were actually a founding member of TCR almost 15 years ago and have reported every year since. So before leaving this slide, I just would point out that if you think about 44%, it's really quite significant if you compare it to, say, the previous administration's Clean Power Plan, which would have required a 32% reduction by 2030. It's significant if you think about the Paris Climate Accord, which would have required a 26 to 28% reduction. So really, if you look at our corporate electric sector emissions, they are in excess of both of those policies, and we're well on our way, better than halfway to our 80% reduction target at the end of the decade. There are a number of reasons why we made this commitment, and I'll talk about 3 of them. Customers, climate science, and new technology. And I really like the comments that Jason just made about the need for new technology and the engineering required for it. We really agree. First, on customers, and I don't have a slide on this, but we serve 17 communities across our service territory who have carbon reduction goals, and many of those are zero carbon goals. So absolutely part of the driver for this announcement was serving our customers and the needs that they're asking for, the type of energy that they're asking for. The second one was grounding in climate science, and you can move to the next slide, goals grounded in science. If you think back to 2018, the so-called trilogy of climate reports was released, the 4th National Climate Assessment, the UN Emissions Gap Report, the IPCC 1.5 degree report, all really pointing to a conclusion that the utility sector must lead, and the utility sector probably has to get to zero or net zero by mid-century. We worked with a IPCC lead author at the University of Denver on an analysis that I think is unique within the industry, comparing our historic and future projected emissions reductions against IPCC scenarios in the IPCC database, both for 2 degrees C, as you see here in this chart, but we also conducted it for 1.5 degrees C. And what that research found, and I invite you to download the white paper that's available on our website, but what that research found is that this trajectory is either in line with or better than both 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C scenarios. So there are a number of scenarios in this gray area, 17 of them actually, that comprise this level of emissions reduction. And you can see that the red line is below the vast majority of those scenarios. It's a similar trend as well for 1.5 degrees C. So clearly responding to the climate science was a key driver for us. It continues to be, and something that we very much continue to work on and assess our risks against. If you move to the next slide, achieving this vision, there are really a number of things that need to come together to make this happen. First and foremost, and I think you probably hear this from any utility company, we have to protect reliability and affordability. Our customers over the last decade, on average, have spent less money on their energy bills, about $3,300 less on electric and about $1,000 less for natural gas. And we would expect those trends to continue. We absolutely will not force a transition that is not in a cost-effective manner for our customers. We also can't do anything that forces the grid to become unreliable. And so these are the table stakes. These are first and foremost things that have to come together. The second is the support from our states and stakeholders. And this is really it takes a village. It's going to take our state regulators, our federal regulators, NGO partners, the private sector, engineers, as Jason had talked about, to work together toward this common vision. And thirdly, we really think that common vision should be greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We can't really go down multiple paths in, for example, investing in higher cost resources that don't get to a zero carbon future. And we can't also become a smaller utility company in the process either by being disintermediated from our customers or other strategies that divert from what we think is really the prize here, zero carbon emissions by 2050. And finally, and something I'm spending a lot of my own time on, we know today that we will need some new forms of carbon-free, 24/7 or dispatchable technologies post-2030. We know that a primarily renewable pathway will hit diminishing returns, and I hope we can discuss that in the conversation following. So we know today that in the 2030s and the 2040s, we're going to need some innovation around new technologies. Going to the next slide, in terms of the path to an 80% reduction by 2030, however, we think we can do that largely with current technology. So the primary driver for it is an increase in renewable generation. We will nearly double the renewable capacity on our system to roughly 60% generation by 2030. We absolutely see a role for natural gas and energy storage. In fact, when we see that when our models and the models of others constrain these types of resources, costs really do go up. In the upper Midwest, where we operate 2 nuclear plants, there's a really important role for a zero carbon workhorse in our nuclear plants. We've proposed in our plan in the upper Midwest that achieves an 80% reduction to extend the license of one of our nuclear plants at Monticello through 2040. As I mentioned, we're looking to expand energy efficiency programs and increasingly to align them to saving carbon dioxide. These programs are evolving. They were originally created to save kilowatt hours and save MCF of gas. But as public policy advances and as we ask more of those programs, we also need to think about how we further push energy efficiency. Retiring coal and coal plant operations is a big part of our transition. We have approval to retire 2 units in Pueblo, Colorado as part of the Colorado Energy Plan. Our Northern States Power Plan, which we filed with regulators in Minnesota, would have us retiring remaining coal units by 2030, the 2 remaining coal units by 2030. That is absolutely part of the transition that we see for the future. And then finally, strategic electrification, or beneficial electrification, as it's sometimes called. This is really going to be key to the strategy. The utility sector is a pathway to a low carbon economy, no question. And so maximizing the efficiency of the grid, matching loads to high amounts of intermittent renewables, and also reducing carbon in other sectors, primarily transportation, but also the built environment and oil and gas operations are some of the opportunities that we see. So think about current technology to get to an 80% reduction. After that, for the remaining 20%, we know today we'll need some form of new technology. And if you go to the next slide, path to the 2050 aspiration, these are the types of technologies that we think hold promise to get there. And just going through these, advanced dispatchable renewables. This is primarily a look at deep geothermal technologies, which utilize a drilling technology to get to very deep depths, but can operate, again, in a 24/7 capacity in a way that current wind and solar technologies could not. Zero carbon fuels, this includes things like hydrogen, developing fuels, green hydrogen through a variety of forms, which could include using nuclear electricity to split water through electrolysis. It could include renewables that would otherwise be curtailed to do just the same. But we do see a role for zero carbon fuels, both for direct use in our natural gas distribution company and for generation. Advanced nuclear, this could include both fusion and fission, and there's a lot of work being done here, particularly with modular reactors. Carbon capture and sequestration, primarily for natural gas, and long duration storage and demand response. And here really thinking of very long duration, so not hours, but days, weeks, and even months. We really think that the storage is a key limitation for a high renewables future. And really thinking about weeks to months being necessary to either shed load or bring on some form of seasonal storage. Again, these are the types of technologies. These are examples. We think that the future probably includes some number of these types, and there are a variety of different technology vendors in each of these categories. But these are the types of things that we're trying to promote through state and federal policy. And that is my last slide, looking ahead to carbon-free technology policy. You think about those 5 technology areas that I just talked about. How does a utility company or a state or a municipality create the conditions that are going to pull these into existence? This is a really big challenge that we all face, addressing that last increment of carbon reductions. And we are not great at R&D on energy in the United States. So we think it's some component of these 4 things, both at the state and the federal level. R&D funding really needs to be focused on these carbon-free technologies. We spend a lot of R&D money on things that are pretty well proven already, but how do we really focus on these things that are going to get us the last mile? It probably includes more funding, but it certainly includes more focused funding. Commercialization for those technologies that leave the lab bench, this is that very risky period for them, that first of a kind to nth of a kind, or what some refer to as folk to noke, where the failure rate's pretty high and the costs are pretty high, the risks are high. There are public policies that can be enacted to de-risk those investments to try to bridge that period for new technologies. Some will continue to advance and will make it through commercialization, and then will need to be deployed at scale. Think about what happened with wind and solar and the production tax credits and the investment tax credits that were used to really scale those technologies to deployment levels. So this is the nth of a kind really to market competitiveness. And finally, a bit of a catch-all ecosystem. This is kind of everything else. If we had these technologies, or one of them or 2 of them, and they were cost competitive and they were reliable, do we have the infrastructure? Can we permit them? Is there enough transmission? Can we interconnect them? Is there an available workforce? Is there public acceptance? It's not too early to be thinking about those things that support this overall strategy. So I'll conclude my comments there, say thank you to the hosts, and look forward to the conversation.
All right, thanks so much to everybody who just presented. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex Carr from the Climate Registry, and she's going to lead us through a moderated discussion, and then I will take questions from the audience towards the end. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Marina. So I just wanted to, in terms of the first question, just want to kind of ground us in our current reality and looking back to when we handed these awards out in Detroit at the beginning of March. That seems like a completely different world. Obviously, things have changed substantially since then, and I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you that organizations and governments everywhere are grappling with a number of significant challenges, be it COVID, economic recovery efforts, in addition to climate change. So I'm interested in understanding how your organizations are managing and prioritizing climate action and initiatives given our current tough reality. And are there any lessons learned or any of the lessons that you have learned from gaining internal support for your ambitious carbon reduction efforts? Do those also apply to this current moment? So Jeremy, I'm going to put you on the spot here because I'm sure our City of LA is grappling with these challenges as we speak. So I would love to hear a little bit about how you're managing through it.
Sure. Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things. So on the climate change front, I guess, with shifting priorities and things like that, the reality is climate change is such a broad, widespread issue. One thing that we did even before COVID is we started looking at co-benefits and things like that, right? So even if you're looking at economic recovery, you're looking at financial or budgetary issues, right? We can start looking at energy audits and operational cost savings that we can do that will still further our progress towards our climate objectives, but also help address some of the fiscal challenges we may be facing. If you want to talk about public health and COVID, the reality is greenhouse gas emissions are strongly correlated to air quality or criteria air pollutants, right? And so by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you're reducing air quality or reducing criteria air emissions, and you're improving air quality, and you're reducing asthma and other health impacts in neighborhoods that are typically tend to be environmental justice communities that are already overburdened. And I think the other thing that we've tried to do and will continue to try to do moving forward is sort of try to institutionalize and weave this work into everything that we do, right? When we talk about climate resiliency and we look at our capital improvement program, we just make climate resiliency part of the capital improvement program. It's not a separate program. It's not its own priority. It's part of the standard capital improvement projects. And so regardless of what you're trying to accomplish, that it's just ingrained, right? Similarly, a lot of the data sets and all the analysis, we do it in-house. So it's just the staff understand it. We have a good understanding of the data and the science, and we can integrate it into whatever that next challenge or that next priority or that next goal is. We can still weave what we're doing into that. So I think that's sort of been our approach to how we maintain our climate action in this sort of uncertain times, or maybe times where priorities might be shifting.
That's great. It's heartening to hear. Chad, do you have anything to add in terms of what's happening with the Airport Authority?
Sure, absolutely. And wider, from my perspective, the aviation industry seems to be doubling down on sustainability at this time. And like every organization at SAN, there's a strong focus on fiscal resilience, financial resilience plans. But frameworks like LEAD and Vision and Park Smarts and others, they really provide frameworks for early integration and sustainability to reduce costs, to produce higher performance projects. So some projects in our capital improvement plan program have been deferred. Some have been canceled, but some are accelerated. For instance, we have a hydrant fueling project that takes diesel trucks fueling trucks that provide Jet A to aircraft. Hydrant fueling is taking these trucks off the airfield. Emissions reductions health and safety reductions. That project is been delivered because we have lesser operations. It's actually facilitating a quicker project build out. We do have a proposed new Terminal 1 that we've, that has been slated for construction. With this removal of our old Terminal 1 and replacing it with a new, there are lots of efficiencies that are potentially able to be gained in terms of maybe cost of capital, things like that. So as we program in, high performance building, low energy use intensity numbers, as we use the sustainability frameworks that I mentioned, as we, look for opportunities to deploy more solar. We currently have 5.5 megawatts of solar. One project that hasn't been deferred is our battery energy storage system that was mentioned a few moments ago. We have a 2 megawatt, 4 megawatt hour battery that's going to come online in probably the next few weeks. Very exciting. So as we look at these types of projects and new implementation, we are able to think about how to deploy more electrification assets to make our campus even more, to reduce carbon and make them even more higher performing. The last thing I'll say is the authority's goals are aligned with state goals, and so we're working, with California regulators, California Air Resource Board, under a few potential mandates. But we are working on an energy master plan as we speak to think about what the future at SAN will look like with the deployment of 100% electric shuttle buses, with 100% electric ground support equipment airside to replace a lot of diesel equipment. We're looking at better ways to leverage our 12 kilovolt energy electricity distribution loop around campus. So to be able to minimize third-party or scope 3 emissions as airplanes plug into our electric power, ground power, and preconditioned air, as different ground support equipment can plug into an electric vehicle infrastructure that's airside. So I've actually never been more busy. I think everyone at the Airport Authority is incredibly busy working on all these initiatives, and we just have to do it with a focus on the most prioritizing the projects that have the most bang for the buck, if you will. That was kind of long and rambling, but I'll pause there.
No, thanks, Chad. And I love that creativity is baked right into your sustainability strategy. That's fantastic. Over to Jason. Jason, did you want to say anything in response to this question? Okay, we might have lost Jason, so I'm going
had to hit the
there you
mute. So
okay.
Sorry about that. So
no problem.
I would say probably two major areas where sort of the health impact has impacted us is one is, with sort of the decline in energy demand, it has had a pretty significant impact on state revenues, which, sort of there's certainly this cascading effect over what the state can and can't do. And, the other area, and that just sort of, expands not just outside of Wyoming, but globally as well, is with lower revenues and lower resource or smaller resources to deal with, when you're faced with, a lot of different choices, and our policymakers and decision makers will have to make those choices regarding, kind of needs versus wants. And so, our carbon mitigation, I guess, efforts as a whole as a state have always been very well supported by our legislature and our governors. So we'll just have to see what that looks like in the future. So that's probably the biggest direct impact that we're seeing.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And Jeff, just before I punt to you, just, we couldn't be happier that you've been a part of the TCR community for all these years. And we thank you for not only being a founder, but for your leadership during that time. So over to you.
Well, thank you. Three just really brief thoughts on this question about COVID impacts, and I'll start where Jason started. I think cost consciousness is very real. We had our legislatures, I think, had a pretty robust clean energy agenda, in the queue, and of course, our states were very similar to what happened nationally in that the attention all focused to balancing the state budget, and so I think there was probably a pretty significant clean energy agenda across the country that didn't advance because of the need to do the first job, which is balancing the state budget. And of course, we have to be cost conscious more so than ever on anything that we're doing that has an impact on our customers. So I think that's a very real factor. I think secondly, there may be some opportunity to advance projects, advance clean energy projects. I think that's along the lines of what Chad was saying. There's some interest among regulators and policymakers in thinking about back to work programs, governors' initiatives that they're putting together. How do we affect a clean energy transition as part of a workforce redevelopment effort? And then, lastly, and something that I've been trying to really understand further, what are the carbon impacts here? EIA is projecting that nationally the carbon impact could be as much as 10 or 11%. But I think the question is, how persistent will that be? We do think there's clearly a shift to more residential load in the near term, and maybe some of that will become permanent as some of us work from home permanently. But if we think about long-term carbon goals, right, 2025, 2030, 2050, does this become essentially a blip in the chart, and does the economy respond such that we are ultimately on the same trajectory that we were? I think that's a pretty interesting open question right now.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Jeff. And I think there's just just don't have a lot of answers at the moment. But I have to say the four of you have given me a sense of cautious optimism that we can continue to address the climate crisis while also dealing with the very significant and often devastating ramifications of COVID. So on that, Verena, I'm going to turn it over to you, knowing we have 4 minutes left and there might be some questions out there from the folks on the line.
Yeah, and I always wish we had more time than we actually do, but I'm going to synthesize a few comments that are coming in from our listeners, and it's really about looking at, as we move to new technologies, as we move to electrification, what are some of the main considerations that policymakers need to think about when promoting these strategies? And then, Jeff, specific to you, I think folks want to learn a little bit more about how Xcel is thinking about natural gas as well as nuclear and hydrogen and energy storage. So the first part of the question is, when we move to new technologies, and especially the need to electrify, what are some considerations for policymakers to promote this kind of strategy? And then, Jeff, a specific question on some technologies. All right, let's start with Chad this time.
Sure, yeah. So we have an eye toward electrification of really, as much as we can at the airport. In fact, 4 new support buildings in advance of our new Terminal 1 don't even have natural gas connection. So we're programming low energy use intensities into buildings, thinking about net zero, spending a lot of time with parking, parking structures, et cetera, to program as much as we can for electric vehicles. There's some pretty aggressive growth on EVs in California. The current moment, maybe notwithstanding. So we're thinking about, how can we create an energy distribution system on campus, working closely with our local utility to be able to support electrification of as much as we can.
Great, thank you. And we'll go Jason, Jeremy, and then Jeff.
Sure. So, I think when you talk about linking policies, we were talking a little bit earlier about, are these things permittable? But I mean, permittable is there a regulatory regime to actually link everything together When you think about the energy grid, it's a pretty complex, sort of evolving, ever-changing organism that feeds off a lot of different public service commissions in different states that have different regulations. When you look, especially in the West, where you have such a high percentage of like federal land ownership, when you enter into a NEPA process. So when you're moving, building transmission lines to say to link, renewables and solar projects, anything, what sort of wildlife impacts do you have? How do you move it from point A to point B? So, these are real considerations that people need to think about that I don't think are first and foremost. Another one is sort of critical minerals. When you look at the rare earths that will be needed for battery storage and a lot of the wind turbines and those types of things, where are we getting those critical minerals? Are they domestic? Actually, most of them do come from Asia right now. So, we need to think about things real holistically and big picture, and how do you link these pieces together?
Great, thank you. Jeremy?
Thanks. So a couple of thoughts on that. One is, I think, when we're forming our policies and sort of our plan moving forward, I think we should always try to be as sort of technology agnostic as possible. Why, let's not limit ourselves to what we can imagine right now or what the technologies we have right now. If there are new technologies that come out or, new options that become available, let's try to set our framework so that these technologies can be adopted as quickly as possible. The other thing I would say is also making sure that you build the infrastructure to support the technologies, right? EVs is a great example, right? We can procure all the electric vehicles we want. We can put a lot of money into that. If you don't build out the charging stations, you don't build out the charging infrastructure, you're still going to struggle to push that adoption because there's just nowhere to charge, right? And then the third thing I would say is also making sure that we put effort into public education and outreach. I think, if we look at the waste sector, right, we can come up with all the technologies to anaerobically digest our food waste or how to deal with our food waste, composting, whatever it might be. But if we don't actually have the supporting public education programs that will get people to divert the organics, whether it's sorting the trash or whether it's putting into green waste bin, if you don't actually put effort into that aspect as well, you're going to build all these technologies and be unable to collect the organic waste. So I think educating the public and behavior change is also an important aspect of meeting all of our climate sustainability goals.
Awesome, thank you. And Jeff?
What I would say on this is that I think the natural gas system, both generation and direct use, is not inconsistent with a low carbon future. We think that there is tremendous value that natural gas is providing now, but it's clear that electrification is emerging as a climate strategy, and we support it. It doesn't mean, though, that we should leap to all electrification, and in fact, doing so, I think, would have some pretty unintended dire consequences. It could actually triple the peak capacity of our electric system, for example, and actually move it to winter peaking, which would have much less benefit to incremental new wind, and particular solar, because it would have a much lower load carrying capacity if we were nighttime winter peaking. It also would really shift a very high amount of cost to folks that remain on the natural gas system. And those that aren't able to convert to electric, because there would be some cost associated with doing it. For example, our low-income customers would risk bearing a disproportionate share of the remaining system costs. So we really think that a strategic electrification approach is the way to think about this, one that saves money, saves greenhouse gases, moves the grid to a higher state of efficiency, and really resisting the thinking that natural gas needs to be banned, but really going after those loads that make sense today. Especially to our natural gas system, which I didn't have much time to talk about, but we're doing a lot of work in that area. And you can think about it in terms of the two primary pollutants, right? Methane, which is an upstream concern, methane that's leaked in the production, the midstream, and the distribution, and CO2 when that methane is combusted at the customer premise. We are looking actively at our own procurement and asking more of our suppliers on their methane leakage rates and their best management practices. We joined a group called Our Nation's Energy Future, which is committed to keeping the supply chain emissions below 1% per year. And we've participated in a number of EPA programs, Natural Gas Star, Methane Challenge as well, to, again, mitigate those methane leaks. But even with the higher global warming potential of methane, really the bigger factor is CO2. And those customer emissions, when they use that natural gas, I think is a place to really focus. We're going to be rolling out programs that increase gas demand side management, energy efficiency programs, rolling out programs that promote beneficial electrification in water heating, in space heating, and all electric communities. And we've actually got an RFI out right now looking for information on renewable natural gas. There may be a way to voluntarily supply renewable natural gas into the gas system for customers that want to address those emissions. But importantly, those are going to be voluntary programs, and there's going to be an incremental expense to participants. So we've got to pilot them aggressively, and identify which programs can scale. I think I'll stop there, Verena.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. We are at time. I want to thank our 4 presenters and Alex for joining me today in our webinar. The webinar will be available within a day on our website. It'll be on our YouTube channel. So go ahead and in about 24, 48 hours, take a look back at our website and you should see it there. Thanks everyone for joining. And with that, we'll see you next time.